Welcome back, history students. Today we're going to continue with the Reconstruction era. Last video we were talking about President Johnson's actions in his early months as president when Congress was adjourned, and we talked a little bit about some of the actions that Johnson attempted, like trying to reconstruct the nation in a very lenient manner, giving out hundreds of pardons to Confederates, which upset the radical Republicans in Congress. And then when Congress came back into session, they created the Military Reconstruction Act, which I already covered. So we're going to get up to Johnson's impeachment as president. Before we get to Johnson's impeachment, I just want to talk about the tension between the radical Republicans in Congress that wanted to punish the South for the Civil War and President Johnson. That's Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, and became president after Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Johnson versus College. Johnson versus Congress. Johnson opposed a lot of the actions of the radical Republicans when they came back to Congress. Johnson and the Republicans in Congress did not see eye to eye on many things. As I mentioned, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that led to the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. I didn't mention the 15th Amendment before, but let me put that on here. This was another law that Congress passed in order to protect the rights of the freedmen. The 15th Amendment forbids states from denying citizens the right to vote based on their race, their color, or their previous condition of servitude. What some of the southern states were doing was they were trying to deny black men the right to vote. And one of the things the South would do is they would say, you can't vote if your grandfather was a slave. So that excluded all of the African American men from voting because all of their grandfathers had been enslaved. The 15th Amendment made that kind of law unconstitutional. So these are some of the laws, like the 14th Amendment, which guarantees the right of all citizens, regardless of race, religion, or color. And the 15th Amendment, which guarantees the right to vote of people regardless of color. Now, one thing I will note about the 15th Amendment, they did omit gender from the 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment says the states can't deny citizens the right to vote based on their race, their color, or whether or not they were a slave or their family was enslaved. But it doesn't say anything about gender. So women were still excluded from voting, and we're going to get to that topic later on. Now, President Johnson believed all of these laws were unnecessary. He didn't support the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He didn't support the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment. He felt, let's just reconstruct the nation and we're done. We don't have to worry about the former slaves' rights. The radical Republicans disagreed with that. And so this was a point where the president relied on the veto power. So all of these laws that Congress passed, Johnson would veto. And they would pass it over his veto because they had enough votes in Congress to pass these laws over Johnson's veto. So Congress and the president do not see eye to eye during this time period. And eventually the radical Republicans want to get rid of Johnson. It was Congress passed a law, and I have it here, called the Tenure of Office Act. And that law said the president cannot remove a cabinet official without consent of the Senate, of the U.S. Senate. In other words, the president can't fire anyone in his cabinet unless the Senate votes to approve it. The reason they passed that law is they were trying to protect the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was a leftover from Lincoln's administration. And Edwin Stanton had been very critical of Johnson. He didn't get along with Johnson, and Congress knew that Johnson wanted to fire Edwin Stanton. So that law was passed to protect Stanton so that he wouldn't be allowed to be fired legally. And Johnson fell for the trap. And as the radical Republicans suspected, Johnson fired Stanton. And that was one of the reasons why Congress voted to impeach Johnson, because they said this was a law. And again, the Tenure of Office Act, of course, was passed over Johnson's veto. So that was one reason why the Congress voted to impeach Johnson, is they said he was ignoring federal law because he ignored the Tenure of Office Act and he fired Edwin Stanton. That was one of the charges against Johnson. So let's talk about how impeachment works in Congress and what happened with Johnson. The impeachment and removal process was created to ensure that the US president doesn't become a dictator. Presidents are human. They can make mistakes. They can't abuse power like anyone in any other country, right? Because people are human. So one of the checks on the president's power is impeachment and removal. Congress has the power to impeach and remove a president from office if they feel the president has abused his power or has broken the law. Presidents are not above the law. Just because you're president doesn't mean you can ignore the law. President is just like you and me, they have to follow the law. So the way that impeachment and removal works is it starts in the House of Representatives. If the House members of the House of Representatives in Congress feel the president has abused his power or done something illegal, they will investigate, and if they find evidence that something has been wronged, he's done something wrong, they will bring up what's called articles of impeachment. And an article of impeachment is really a charge against the president of committing some kind of crime. Now, if you or I were charged with a crime, would we be put in prison for 20 years immediately without a trial? No. The president has a right to defend himself, just like you or I, if we were charged with a crime, would have a right to defend ourselves, innocent until proven guilty. So when a president gets impeached, all that means is that members of the House of Representatives have charged him with something illegal. And you have to have a lot of votes in the House to impeach the president. So once the president's impeached, it doesn't mean he has to leave office. He has now a right to defend himself. So then we move to the other house of Congress, the U.S. Senate. And in the Senate, the president has a trial. He has a right to defend himself in trial. That trial would determine if the president has to step down from power, if he's found innocent or guilty. In the trial, it's just like a trial, a criminal trial. The president is considered the defendant. He has lawyers to defend him, just like a defendant in any other case would have lawyers. The jury are the members of the Senate, and they hear the case, and then they're going to vote. The prosecution are people from the House of Representatives who brought the charges of impeachment forward in the first place. They have to argue their case of what the president did wrong. The judge is the head of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice. That person serves as the judge over the case. And it's a trial. So the president has a right to defend himself. He has a defense. And there's a prosecution, and the jury are the members of the Senate. Now, once the evidence has been presented and both sides have had a chance to argue their case, then the full Senate votes. In order to remove a president from office, you need a 2/3 majority vote to remove the president. They did not have enough votes to remove Johnson as president. It was very close, but not enough. Now, if there aren't enough votes to remove the president from office, he finishes out the rest of his term. Now, in history, we have impeached several presidents. We've impeached Andrew Johnson, but did not remove him from office. There were not enough votes in the Senate. We impeached Bill Clinton, but there were not enough votes in the Senate to remove him from office. And Donald Trump was just impeached recently. And once again, there were not enough votes in the Senate to remove him from office. So we have had 3 presidents in U.S. history who have been impeached. None of the 3 have been removed from office. A lot of students think that Richard Nixon was impeached. Richard Nixon was not impeached because he resigned before the House voted to impeach him. They were planning to impeach him, but you don't impeach someone who's not president. So once he resigned, he no longer was president, therefore he was not impeached. So in the case of Andrew Johnson, the tension between himself and the radical Republicans in Congress led to an impeachment, but in the Senate trial, they didn't have enough votes. And the rest of Johnson's term was pretty quiet. And that brings us to the election of 1868. The Republicans aren't going to nominate Johnson, who didn't get along with the Republican Party. So the Republicans nominate Ulysses S. Grant, who had been the general of the Union Army at the end of the war. And the Democrats nominate a man named Horatio Seymour. Grant, of course, won the election. He's the big hero from the war. And that wasn't a very difficult election for Grant to win. We're going to look a little bit more at Reconstruction for a minute, politics later. But Reconstruction, the Reconstruction era changed the South. We have the North rebuilding the South after the war because a lot of the South was damaged in the war. So that was a good thing that came out of the war was the South was rebuilt. We have African American men being able to vote for the first time. And there are many African American men who were elected to public office. Now, I'm going to get to the end of the Reconstruction later. And again, that'll be in a later video. That was a short-lived victory for African American men. Now, we also have many Northerners moving to the South to work in the new governments down South. And Southerners didn't like these Northerners moving south, and they called them the carpetbaggers. A carpetbagger at the time was a Northerner who comes to the South during Reconstruction to take advantage of the South. And so the Southerners looked at the carpetbaggers as greedy Northerners who were coming down south with their empty carpet bags. Carpet bags were a popular kind of suitcase back then. The outside of it looks like carpet. And they were going to fill up their bags with ill-gotten goods. They were going to take advantage of the South and get what they could out of the South during the Reconstruction period. That's how the South viewed the carpetbaggers. You might wonder, well, what were they going to get from the South? Well, one of the things they were going to get is votes for the Northern Party. The Republican Party was the Northern Party at this point. Remember, it was Lincoln's party. A lot of Southerners thought the carpetbaggers were coming down south and they were promising poor Southern voters all kinds of things to get them to vote for the Republican candidates. So they felt like the carpetbaggers were promising poor whites in the South that they were going to get them jobs and they were going to get them tax breaks if they voted for the Republican Party. And they were also carpetbaggers trying to get black men to vote for the Republican Party. So that's why the Southerners didn't like the carpetbaggers, and they thought they were trying to take advantage of the South in this weakened state that the South was in. Now, if the Southerners hated the carpetbaggers after the war, they hated the scalawags even more than the carpetbaggers. Scalawags were hated in the South during Reconstruction. A scalawag was a white Southerner who voted for the Republican Party during Reconstruction. And a lot of Southern Democrats believed that the scalawags were duped and bribed by the carpetbaggers to vote for the Republican Party. White voting Democrats in the South, a scalawag was a traitor. You know, how dare a white Southerner vote for Lincoln's party, the party that defeated the South in the Civil War? Southerners felt the carpetbaggers were responsible for the scalawags. that they were tricking poor white uneducated voters to vote for the Republican Party with all these fake promises. So that's two groups of people in the South after the Civil War that white Southerners hated. All right, let's look at the result of Reconstruction. And again, I'll get to the end of Reconstruction in a later video. Let's look at overall positive and negative outcomes of the Reconstruction period. Well, I mean, number one, the positive outcome is the end of slavery with the 13th Amendment. So that there will no longer be slavery tolerated in the United States. We are no longer a slave nation as we were before the war. So that's obviously the number one positive. Number two, positive. Former slaves who are men are able to vote because of the 15th Amendment. So it did allow black men to vote now with the 15th Amendment. Again, women can't vote, but black men can vote. That's another achievement of the Reconstruction period. As I mentioned just before, the North did help to rebuild the South. All the railroads that were destroyed were rebuilt in the South. All of the roads were fixed. The buildings that were destroyed were reconstructed. And so the North did help to rebuild the South after the war. That's a positive. The Freedmen's Bureau is another positive thing that came out of Reconstruction. It led to some new educational opportunities for the former slaves. So there are some good positive things that come out of the Reconstruction era. I would put obviously all the new laws that came out, especially the 14th and 15th Amendments that guaranteed equal rights regardless of race, and the black men's right to vote with the 15th Amendment. So that's positive things that come out of Reconstruction. All right, but it wasn't all positive. There were some negative outcomes of Reconstruction. Let's look at negative. Obviously, Reconstruction era does not end racism. There's still racial discrimination today. So that wasn't solved with the Reconstruction period. Another negative outcome is sharecropping. Sharecropping emerged as a popular occupation, especially for the former slaves, after the Civil War. So let me explain sharecropping really quickly. After the Civil War, the slave owners lost all of their slaves. Now remember, in the South, the main industry is farming. And the slaves were freed. Now, the government did not compensate slave owners for freeing the slaves, and the government did not give the slaves any money or anything, land, nothing, to get started. So the government really didn't give out financial help to either side. So sharecropping emerged out of this situation. So we have all of these farms that need labor, and then we have a lot of former slaves that need work, and that's where sharecropping comes in. Sharecropping is when a landowner let's say they had slaves, they're freed, now they need workers. So poor farmers, many of whom were former slaves, agreed to work on a landowner's land. That farmer wasn't paid a salary. They were given a place to live on the landowner's land, a place for their family to live. They were given basic things they needed, like food and supplies, but they were not given a salary. You weren't paid an hourly wage. The landowners, many of whom lost their slaves, are cash poor. They don't have a lot of cash to pay a wage, even if they wanted to. So sharecropping works for the landowners because they have poor farmers live on their land and work the land, so the land is worked. The land is harvested. But they don't have to pay a salary. Now, the idea of sharecropping is to share the crops. In other words, when the crops come in, the landowner and the poor farmers split the crops. Now, the landowner is going to use some for himself, but probably sell the surplus to pay for his mortgage on his land or whatever else he needs to do. The poor farmers also will use some of the crops for themselves, but the idea of sharecropping is that they will also be able to sell the surplus and be able to buy supplies and hopefully eventually save up enough money to buy their own plot of land. It sounds equal on paper. It sounds like a solution for everybody. The landowner in sharecropping doesn't have to pay out a salary, but the land still gets harvested. The poor farmer has a place to live with his family. He has work to do, and he has a means of supporting his family, hopefully by selling the surplus of crops. And the dream of a poor farmer is to one day own his own land. So a sharecropper's dream is to work the land a few years, save up enough money to buy his own land, and eventually move on to his own land. That's a sharecropper's dream. It doesn't work that way in practice. What inevitably happened in most sharecropping situations, not all, but most, was the poor farmers were the ones who were taken advantage of, not the landowners. If you have one or two bad seasons, which happens often in farming, you have a drought, you have too much rain, you have insects, you have a storm that ruins the crops. If you farm, you're at the mercy of Mother Nature. There is a year or two of bad crops. What happened to the poor farmers is they ended up indebted to the landowner because they didn't have any crops to sell. They need supplies for the next year, so they go to the landowner, they buy the supplies, they say, I'll pay you back when the next year's crop come in. What if there's 2 or 3 years of bad crops? A lot of sharecroppers ended up indebted to the landowners, and that debt was passed down to their next generation. So there were generations of poor sharecroppers who were trapped, indebted to the landowners. They could never leave the land. So sharecropping really hurt poor farmers, many of whom were former slaves. A lot of poor African American families ended up as sharecroppers, although there also were poor white families that were sharecropper families also. So I put sharecropping as a negative outcome of Reconstruction because in some instances, it does extend slavery. Because poor farmers are indebted to the landowners and they can't leave the land. So in the long run, it really hurt the poor farmers. Now, again, I'm going to reiterate, not all sharecroppers became indebted. There are stories of sharecroppers that were able to eventually buy their own land, but that wasn't the norm. But it did happen. There were some sharecroppers that were able to save up enough money and buy their own land. But again, that wasn't the norm. So that's sharecropping, and that's why I put it under the negative outcome. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, is another thing that came out of Reconstruction that I put under negative. The KKK was founded in Tennessee right after the war, about 1866. Their original goal was to scare Republicans in the South to vote for the Democratic Party. So they would use intimidation and violence to control the freedmen and run Republicans out of office, many of whom were black office holders. It became this racist organization that really was less about politics and more about race. And so it really comes out of the Reconstruction era, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. So I put that under a negative result of Reconstruction. Third thing I put under negative results of Reconstruction is the oppression of Native Americans. So I want to talk a little bit about Native Americans, assimilation in a minute. During the Civil War, there were some Native Americans who rejected the land treaties they had signed with the U.S. government years before. Now, if you took American History 1, you would have learned about the government's Indian policy and the Trail of Tears. To briefly summarize, Native Americans pre-Civil War were pushed out of valuable land in the east part of the country, and moved into reservations in the Midwest and West. And the land that the Native Americans were pushed onto was much less valuable than the land they had had in the East. For example, the Cherokee Native Americans had valuable land in Georgia, but under the presidency of Jackson, they were pushed from that land, which part of it was very valuable land, it had some gold on it, and moved to reservations further west, which was much less profitable. During the Civil War, some Native Americans began to reject the former land treaties they felt they had been forced to sign by the government in years earlier. And they tried to regain some of their tribal lands that they felt was taken from them by the government illegally. The U.S. government, of course, used the force to stop those uprisings. When the Civil War ended, there were more disputes between white settlers in the West and Native Americans who were fighting over valuable Western land. And Native Americans began to be pushed even further west than they had been during Jackson's time, and that led to conflicts and battles. And one of the most famous battles I have on your outline is the Battle of Little Bighorn. This happened in Montana in 1876. Again, it was a fight over land rights. In this battle, the Plains Indians, led by a Sioux Indian leader named Sitting Bull, led an attack against Lieutenant Colonel George Custer of the 7th Cavalry. Although the Native Americans won that battle, and in that battle, Custer and over 250 of his men were killed. But what ended up happening is the U.S. government eventually pushed them onto reservations on undesirable land. So there were attempts of Native Americans to rise up and try to regain land they felt was rightfully theirs, that the government had taken from them. But the government used the military to violently stop those uprisings. And in the end, Native Americans were pretty relegated to reservations in the West on land that wasn't very valuable. So that was one of the policies of the U.S. government for many years, was called removal, where the Native Americans were removed from valuable land, pushed onto reservations. They were treated as resident aliens. Remember I told you that Native Americans were originally not part of the 14th Amendment. It wasn't until the 1920s that the Native Americans were added to the 14th Amendment and were considered citizens. So that was one policy of the government, was removing the Native Americans and letting them live separately from the rest of the country. The other policy of the assimilation. Assimilation is where Native Americans are encouraged to adopt American culture and become more like white society. That's assimilation policy. After the Civil War, there was a big focus on assimilation of Native Americans. Now, this was not done directly by the U.S. government. It was done by a lot of Christian missionaries. Christian missionary groups would set up schools for Native American children, and the goal of these schools was to assimilate the children into white society. So, and these are boarding schools. These are not schools where children would go during the day and go home at night. Because if you're going to assimilate children, you have to take them away from their family and their reservation. One of the most famous of these schools was the Carlisle School, which is located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Opened in 1879. It operated for about 30 years. Now, these schools, like the Carlisle School, again, were not set up by the U.S. government, but they had the approval of the U.S. government. And the focus was to instill Christian values to the Native American children and make the children forget their Native American culture and become like white Anglo-Saxon society. The man who founded the Carlisle School is Colonel Richard Henry Pratt. Now, I have some photographs to show you from Creative Commons. This is Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. He was the headmaster of the Carlisle School. He had a famous motto regarding the school. His motto was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." He truly believed that Native Americans will never succeed in American society unless they erase their Native American culture and embrace white culture in American society. So the goal of the Carlisle School was to westernize the Native American children and erase their Native American culture. Let me show you a picture of from the Carlisle School. This is a photograph of the Carlisle School. In the Carlisle School, the children, this is a boarding school, so they would be far away from their families on their home reservations. And these are Native American children from many different reservations. They would be given a uniform, clothing. Their hair was cut in the style of what white society wore. So boys were not allowed to have long hair. Their hair was cut short. They were taught about the Christian faith and baptized in the Christian church. And they were taught Christian studies. They were taught to read and write English. Now, here's the other thing that happened. These children were not allowed to use their Native American name that they were known in their reservations. They were given an Anglo name. So they were not allowed to be called by their Native American names. They all had to use their Anglo name, like Mary and Charles. Now, why would these missionary schools target children? Why assimilate children? This is the next generation of Native Americans. So if you begin with children, they will grow up with new ideas. They will teach their children what they learned at their schools. And this is a way you erase Native American culture. And so hopefully in a few generations, according to the Carlisle School and other schools like this, in a few generations, the Native American culture will be lost. I put this under a negative result of Reconstruction because this did a lot of damage to Native American culture in our country. There are aspects of some Native American groups, aspects of their culture that have been forever lost. There are languages that have been lost. There are oral traditions, oral stories that used to be passed down from generation to generation that have been lost. There are religious teachings that have been lost. A lot of Native American culture was oral tradition. It wasn't written down. And that can be lost in one generation or two generations. So that's the damage that assimilation did. Now, in the 1960s, with the Civil Rights Movement, there was an effort to revive Native American cultures and try to bring back the languages and bring back some of the oral traditions. But there still were aspects that were forever lost. The assimilation policy was based on this idea among these leaders, government leaders, missionary leaders, that Native American society was inferior to white society. There was no respect for Native American culture. And that's why they just wanted to erase Native American culture and replace it with Anglo-American culture, because there was no respect for Native American culture. So that's the legacy of the assimilation program. But we do see that a lot during the Reconstruction era, is the focus on this assimilation policy. So the Reconstruction era was not entirely successful. The one thing, though, was the war was over, slavery ended, and the southern states that had left the Union are now back in the United States. Now, I'm going to get to why the Reconstruction era ended in 1877 in a later video. That's where I'll leave this video, and I'll see you in the next one.